Richard Langley was a man who always chased success. From the moment he graduated college, his life revolved around climbing the ladder of achievement. He worked long hours, made bold decisions, and built an empire that turned heads in the business world. But while Richard's bank account grew, his personal life suffered. His marriage to Eleanor, once filled with laughter and dreams, slowly crumbled under the weight of his ambition. Eleanor was different from Richard. She valued simplicity, cherished quiet evenings at home, and dreamed of raising a family together. At first, she admired Richard's drive and believed they could balance their differences. However, as the years passed, his constant absence became too much to bear. Dinners were eaten alone, vacations were canceled, and promises were broken. The distance between them grew wider until it felt impossible to bridge. One evening, after months of strained silence, Eleanor mustered the courage to speak her mind. "Richard," she began softly, sitting across from him at their dining table. "We need to talk." Richard barely looked up from his laptop, typing furiously, as if nothing else mattered. Frustrated but determined, Eleanor continued, "I'm pregnant." The room fell silent. For a brief moment, Richard stopped typing and stared at her, his face unreadable. Pregnant. The word echoed in his mind like a storm warning. A baby meant responsibility, sleepless nights, and distractions, things he wasn't ready for. Deep down, he knew this news should have brought joy, but all he could think about was how it would interfere with his plans. "I can't do this right now," Richard finally said, closing his laptop and standing abruptly. His voice lacked emotion, almost robotic. "You know how busy I am. This isn't a good time." Eleanor blinked, stunned by his reaction. "It's not about timing, Richard. It's our child, our future." But Richard didn't hear her. In his mind, he had already made up his mind. Over the next few weeks, he distanced himself even more, burying himself in work and avoiding conversations about the pregnancy. Eventually, he convinced himself that leaving was the best solution, not just for him, but for Eleanor too. He told himself she deserved someone better, someone who could give her the attention she needed. So, one cold morning, Richard packed his bags and walked out the door without looking back. He left behind a note explaining his decision, though it did little to soften the blow. Eleanor read it through tears, clutching the piece of paper as if hoping it might change what was written on it. Her heart broke into pieces, but she refused to let despair consume her. She decided then and there that she would raise this child, or children, on her own, no matter how hard it got. What neither of them realized at the time was that fate had something extraordinary in store. Unbeknownst to Richard, Eleanor wasn't carrying just one baby. She was expecting quadruplets, 4 tiny lives growing inside her, each destined to carry a piece of Richard's legacy. And somewhere deep within those innocent faces lay a resemblance, so striking that years later it would force Richard to confront the choices he'd made and the family he'd left behind. Years passed, and Richard Langley's name became synonymous with success. His company dominated the industry, his face appeared on magazine covers, and his bank account swelled to numbers most people could only dream of. Yet, despite all the accolades and achievements, there was an emptiness inside him that no amount of money or fame could fill. The mansion he lived in felt more like a museum than a home, its vast rooms echoing with silence. The parties he hosted were lively, but they ended with Richard standing alone on the balcony, staring at the city lights below. At first, Richard told himself he didn't need anything or anyone else. He convinced himself that relationships were distractions, emotional entanglements that slowed people down. But as the years went by, memories of Eleanor began creeping back into his mind. He remembered her gentle smile, the way she laughed at his jokes, and the warmth she brought to their once happy home. Guilt gnawed at him whenever he thought about how he'd left her, especially when he imagined what life might have been like if he'd stayed. Had she remarried? Was she happy? Did she hate him for walking away? The questions haunted him, but fear kept him from reaching out. What if she refused to see him? What if she blamed him for ruining her life? And then there was the baby, or rather, the child who would now be a teenager. Richard tried not to dwell on it, but sometimes late at night, he wondered what kind of person their child had grown up to be. Would they look like him, act like him, or had Eleanor raised them to forget all about the father who abandoned them? To distract himself, Richard threw himself even deeper into work. He traveled the world, invested in new ventures, and collected luxury cars and watches like trophies. Friends admired his lifestyle, calling him the ultimate bachelor and marveling at his ability to stay unattached. Tabloids speculated endlessly about why such a wealthy and powerful man showed no interest in settling down. Some said he was married to his career. Others claimed he simply hadn't found the right woman. No one knew the truth, that Richard's heart was buried under layers of regret and missed opportunities. Despite his outward confidence, Richard often felt like a spectator in his own life. He attended charity galas, rubbed shoulders with celebrities, and gave speeches at prestigious events, but none of it felt real. It was as though he were watching someone else live his life, a glamorous yet hollow existence. People around him seemed content, but Richard couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was missing. One evening, after returning from yet another business trip, Richard found himself sitting in his study, flipping through old photos. Among them was a faded picture of him and Eleanor taken during happier times. They looked so young, so full of hope. Richard stared at the photo for a long time, tracing the edges with his fingers. For a fleeting moment, he allowed himself to imagine what might have happened if he'd chosen differently, if he'd stayed and faced the challenges of fatherhood instead of running away. But just as quickly as the thought came, he pushed it aside. There was no point dwelling on the past, he told himself. What was done was done. Still, as he placed the photo back in its drawer and turned off the light, a small voice whispered in the back of his mind, "What if you're not too late?" Little did Richard know, fate had plans to answer that question sooner than he expected. Somewhere out there, 4 young faces carried pieces of his story, faces that would soon force him to confront the choices he'd made and the family he'd left behind. Until then, Richard continued living his glittering but lonely life, unaware that the universe was about to send him a reminder of what truly mattered. It was a crisp autumn evening when Richard attended one of the most prestigious charity galas in New York City. The event was held in a grand ballroom adorned with crystal chandeliers, golden accents, and towering floral arrangements that filled the air with a faint scent of roses. Wealthy businessmen, socialites, and celebrities mingled under the soft glow of lights, their laughter blending with the gentle hum of classical music played by a live orchestra. Richard, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging pleasantries and shaking hands. But despite the glamour surrounding him, he felt disconnected, as though he were merely going through the motions. As the night wore on, Richard found himself standing near the entrance, sipping champagne while observing the guests arriving late. That's when he saw them, a group of 4 children walking into the room alongside an elegantly dressed woman. They stood out immediately, not because they were overdressed or flashy, but because of the quiet confidence they exuded. Each child carried themselves with poise, their matching outfits perfectly coordinated yet understated. Something about them caught Richard's attention, though he couldn't quite place why. The first thing Richard noticed was their eyes, bright, piercing blue eyes that seemed to hold a spark of intelligence and curiosity. Then came their features, sharp jawlines, delicate noses, and slight dimples that appeared whenever they smiled. It was uncanny how familiar they looked, as if he'd seen those faces before in a dream. As they passed closer to where Richard stood, his breath caught in his throat. He froze mid-sip, the glass of champagne momentarily forgotten in his hand. Those faces, those unmistakable features, they were his own. For a moment, Richard thought he might be imagining things. Maybe it was just a coincidence, a trick of the light playing on his mind. But the resemblance was too striking to ignore. These children weren't just vaguely similar to him. They were miniature versions of himself, down to the way they tilted their heads when listening or the subtle smirk that crossed their lips when amused. His heart raced as questions flooded his mind. Who were these kids? Why did they look so much like him? And why hadn't he ever seen them before? Before he could approach, the group disappeared into the bustling crowd. Richard tried to follow, weaving through clusters of guests, but the sea of people swallowed them whole. Frustrated, he stopped and scanned the room, hoping to catch another glimpse. Instead, he overheard snippets of conversation from nearby attendees whispering about the quadruplets. Quadruplets. The word sent a jolt through him. 4 children. Could it really be possible? Determined to find answers, Richard flagged down a waiter carrying trays of hors d'oeuvres and asked casually if he knew anything about the family. The waiter shrugged, offering only vague details. They were from out of town, here for the gala to support some cause. Unsatisfied but unwilling to cause a scene, Richard retreated to a quieter corner of the ballroom, his mind racing. Who were these children, and what connection did they have to him? The more he thought about it, the more certain he became that this wasn't mere coincidence. There was something deeper at play, something tied to his past, and perhaps to Eleanor. For the first time in years, Richard felt a flicker of urgency, a need to uncover the truth behind those hauntingly familiar faces. Little did he know, this chance encounter would set off a chain of events that would change his life forever. The next morning, Richard couldn't shake the image of those 4 children from his mind. Their faces lingered in his thoughts like a puzzle he desperately needed to solve. He replayed every detail, their striking resemblance to him, their quiet confidence, even the way they moved together as a unit. It wasn't just curiosity gnawing at him. It was something deeper, almost instinctual. Deep down, he felt certain that these children were connected to him, though he didn't yet know how. Determined to get answers, Richard decided to do what he did best: take control of the situation. He hired a private investigator, someone discreet and highly skilled, with instructions to dig into everything about the quadruplets and the woman accompanying them at the gala. At first, Richard hesitated, wondering if he was overreacting or letting his imagination run wild. But the more he thought about it, the stronger his gut feeling became. This wasn't just coincidence. It was destiny knocking on his door. Over the next few weeks, Richard waited impatiently for updates. He tried to distract himself with work, attending meetings and reviewing proposals, but his focus kept drifting back to the investigation. Each day felt longer than the last, and the uncertainty weighed heavily on him. Finally, the investigator called, asking to meet in person. When Richard arrived at the sleek office downtown, he found a thick file waiting for him on the desk. The investigator began by confirming what Richard already suspected. The quadruplets, named Amelia, Benjamin, Charlotte, and Daniel, were indeed related to Eleanor. The revelation hit Richard like a punch to the chest. His ex-wife, the woman he'd left all those years ago, had somehow raised not 1 child but 4. As the investigator laid out the details, Richard's mind reeled. Eleanor had given birth to quadruplets, a rare and extraordinary event that must have turned her life upside down. And through it all, she had done it alone, without any support from him. What shocked Richard most, however, was learning that Eleanor had never told him about the quadruplets. Not a single word. According to the investigator, Eleanor had deliberately kept their existence hidden, raising them quietly in a suburban town outside Boston. Richard couldn't blame her entirely. He had walked out on her after all. But the knowledge stung nonetheless. How could she keep such a monumental secret from him? Didn't he deserve to know? As he flipped through the file, Richard saw photographs of the children, each one capturing a different facet of their personalities. Amelia, the eldest, looked thoughtful and composed, her eyes reflecting wisdom beyond her years. Benjamin appeared mischievous, his grin hinting at a quick wit. Charlotte's expression was introspective, almost analytical, while Daniel seemed open and curious, his smile warm and inviting. They were all so unique, yet there was no denying the shared traits that linked them and tied them to him. The investigator also provided information about Eleanor's life since their separation. She had worked tirelessly to provide for the children, juggling multiple jobs while navigating the challenges of raising quadruplets. Her sacrifices were evident in the modest home they lived in and the care she had clearly poured into their upbringing. Richard felt a pang of guilt as he realized how much she had endured without him. By the end of the meeting, Richard knew what he had to do. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but the picture they formed was far more complex and emotional than he had anticipated. These children weren't just strangers who happened to look like him. They were part of his legacy, carrying fragments of his DNA and his story. For years, he had convinced himself that walking away was the right choice. But now he understood the magnitude of what he had missed. Richard left the office with a heavy heart, but also a renewed sense of purpose. He didn't know what lay ahead or how Eleanor and the children would react to his sudden reappearance, but one thing was clear: he couldn't ignore this any longer. The time had come to face the past, and perhaps, if he was lucky, begin to make amends. Richard knew that approaching Eleanor after so many years wouldn't be easy. He had spent over a decade building walls around his emotions, convincing himself that he was better off alone. But now, faced with the reality of 4 children who shared his DNA, those walls felt fragile and meaningless. The guilt he buried deep within him resurfaced with a vengeance, gnawing at his conscience. He owed Eleanor an explanation, and more importantly, he owed it to the quadruplets to at least try. After days of rehearsing what he would say, Richard finally picked up the phone and dialed Eleanor's number. His hands trembled as the line rang, each tone stretching out like an eternity. When she answered, her voice was calm but distant, laced with a hint of guarded curiosity. "Eleanor," Richard began, his throat tightening. "It's me." "Richard." There was a pause on the other end, long enough for him to wonder if she might hang up. Instead, she replied simply, "I know." They agreed to meet in person 2 days later at a quiet cafe near her home. Richard arrived early, pacing nervously outside until he saw her pull into the parking lot. She stepped out of her car, looking much the same yet entirely different, her hair streaked with silver, her face lined with the weight of years and responsibilities. Yet there was still a quiet strength about her, the same resilience that had always drawn him to her. The initial moments were awkward. They exchanged pleasantries, their words stiff and formal, as though they were strangers rather than 2 people who had once shared a life. Finally, Richard broke the ice. "Eleanor, I need to talk to you about something important, something I only recently discovered." Her expression shifted slightly, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "What is it?" she asked, her tone cautious. Taking a deep breath, Richard explained everything. The charity gala, the quadruplets' uncanny resemblance to him, and the private investigator's findings. As he spoke, he watched Eleanor's face carefully, searching for any sign of anger or disbelief. To his surprise, she remained composed, her gaze steady. When he finished, there was silence between them, heavy and loaded with unspoken emotions. "You didn't think I'd tell you, did you?" Eleanor said finally, her voice soft but firm. Richard hesitated before answering. "Honestly, no, I didn't, but I understand why you kept it from him. After everything I did, or didn't do, you probably thought I didn't deserve to know." Eleanor sighed deeply, leaning back in her chair. "It wasn't just about punishing you, Richard. It was about protecting them. Raising quadruplets alone wasn't easy. Every day was a battle. Financially, emotionally, physically. And knowing you weren't coming back, well, letting you into their lives felt like opening a door to more pain. I couldn't risk that." Her words struck Richard like a hammer, forcing him to confront the full weight of his absence. He had left thinking he was sparing Eleanor from his chaotic life, but in reality, he had abandoned her to face the hardest journey of all. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice cracking under the weight of his regret. "I can't undo what I've done, but I want to make things right, if you'll let me." For a long moment, Eleanor studied him, as if trying to determine whether his words were genuine. Then she nodded slowly. "Fine, you can meet them, but on my terms. Don't expect them to welcome you with open arms. They don't know much about you, and frankly, they've done just fine without you." Relief washed over Richard, tempered by the sobering reminder that earning their trust wouldn't be easy. Still, he accepted her conditions without hesitation. "Thank you, Eleanor. That's all I ask. For now." As they parted ways, Richard felt a mix of hope and apprehension. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with questions, doubts, and perhaps even rejection. But for the first time in years, he had a purpose beyond wealth and success. He had a chance to reconnect with the family he had walked away from. A second chance he didn't intend to waste. The day Richard was set to meet the Quadruplets, his nerves were stretched taut like a bowstring. For all his confidence in boardrooms and business deals, this felt entirely different. A high-stakes encounter where no amount of money or strategy could guarantee success. He dressed carefully, choosing an outfit that struck a balance between formal and approachable. As he drove to Eleanor's house, he rehearsed what he would say. But every phrase sounded stiff and inadequate. The truth was, nothing could prepare him for what lay ahead. When he arrived, Eleanor greeted him at the door with polite formality. She led him into the living room, where the Quadruplets sat together on the couch, their eyes fixed curiously on him. Richard froze for a moment, taking them in, not through photographs or distant glimpses, but up close, alive and real. They looked even more like him than he'd imagined, each one carrying subtle echoes of his features. Despite their shared genetics, they were undeniably unique. Amelia's composed posture, Benjamin's playful smirk, Charlotte's sharp gaze, and Daniel's open smile. It was overwhelming to see pieces of himself reflected back in 4 distinct personalities. "Kids," Eleanor began gently, breaking the silence. "This is Richard. He's your father." The words hung in the air, heavy and loaded with meaning. The Quadruplets exchanged glances, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. No one said anything at first, leaving Richard standing awkwardly in the middle of the room, unsure of how to proceed. Finally, Benjamin broke the ice. "So, you're the guy who bailed." His tone was light, almost teasing, but there was an edge beneath it that made Richard flinch. He nodded slowly, choosing honesty over deflection. "Yes, I am, and I'm sorry for that." Amelia, ever the oldest and most protective, spoke next. Her voice was measured, her words deliberate. "Why now? Why after all these years do you suddenly show up?" It was a fair question, one Richard had anticipated but still struggled to answer. "Because I didn't know about you until recently," he admitted. "And when I found out, I knew I had to meet you. Not because I expect anything from you, but because you deserve to know me if you want to." Charlotte, quiet and observant, tilted her head slightly. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her tone probing. Richard hesitated, realizing how delicate this moment was. "Nothing," he said firmly. "I don't want anything from you except maybe a chance to get to know you, if you'll let me." Daniel, the youngest and seemingly the most forgiving, chimed in with a grin. "Does this mean we get cool dad stuff, like expensive gifts or trips?" Richard chuckled nervously, shaking his head. "Not exactly. But if you're interested, I'd love to spend time with you. All of you. Maybe we can start small. Go out for coffee or lunch sometime." The atmosphere softened slightly as Daniel laughed, easing some of the tension. Still, the older siblings remained guarded, their body language speaking volumes. Richard understood. Trust wasn't something that could be earned in a single meeting. He respected their caution, even as it stung a little. Over the following weeks, Richard kept his promise, visiting regularly and making an effort to connect with each child individually. With Benjamin, he bonded over sports and jokes. With Charlotte, he discussed books and science, marveling at her sharp intellect. Amelia warmed up slowly, appreciating his attempts to listen rather than dominate conversations. And Daniel, with his infectious enthusiasm, became a source of joy, reminding Richard of the simple pleasures he'd missed in life. Each interaction was a step forward, though progress came in fits and starts. There were moments of connection, laughter, and even shared memories, but also reminders of the years he'd missed. Through it all, Richard remained patient, determined to prove that he was more than the man who had walked away. Bit by bit, the walls began to crumble, replaced by fragile threads of trust. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. As Richard spent more time with the Quadruplets, the layers of their lives began to unfold before him. Each visit revealed new pieces of who they were, pieces he had unknowingly shaped but never witnessed grow. Yet, as much as he cherished these moments, the weight of his absence loomed large over every interaction. It became clear that while the children were slowly warming up to him, there were still wounds that needed healing and truths that needed to be confronted. One evening, during a rare dinner with Eleanor and the kids, the conversation took an unexpected turn. Amelia, always the most outspoken, looked directly at Richard and asked, "Why did you leave, Mom? Was it because of us?" Her question hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and charged with emotion. The room fell silent, all eyes shifting to Richard, waiting for his response. Richard swallowed hard, realizing this was a moment he couldn't sidestep. He owed them honesty, not just for their sake, but for his own. "No," he said firmly, meeting Amelia's gaze. "It wasn't because of you, or your mom. I left because I thought I wasn't ready to be a father. I told myself I was too busy, too focused on work, too selfish to handle the responsibility." His voice softened as he continued. "But looking back now, I see how wrong I was. Leaving didn't solve anything. It only made things harder for everyone." Eleanor watched quietly from across the table, her expression unreadable. Benjamin leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, skepticism etched on his face. "So what changed?" he asked bluntly. "Why are you here now after all these years?" Richard hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because seeing you four at that gala hit me like nothing else ever has. You look so much like me. It felt like staring into a mirror. And when I found out about you, about everything your mom went through raising you alone." His voice cracked slightly, and he paused to steady himself. "I realized I'd missed something incredible, something I can never get back. But I want to try, to make up for lost time, if you'll let me." Charlotte, ever analytical, spoke next. "Do you think money fixes everything? Is that why you're here?" Her question stung, but Richard knew she wasn't being unfair. "No," he replied honestly. "Money doesn't fix anything. Not pain, not mistakes, not years gone by. What I'm offering isn't about wealth. It's about presence. I want to be part of your lives, not to replace what you've built without me, but to add to it in whatever way you'll allow." The room grew quiet again, the weight of his words sinking in. Daniel broke the silence with a small smile. "Well, we could use help with college applications," he joked lightly, earning a nudge from Charlotte and a chuckle from Benjamin. Even Amelia's stern expression softened slightly. Over time, Richard learned more about the sacrifices Eleanor had made. She had worked tirelessly, often taking on multiple jobs to provide for the Quadruplets. She had juggled sleepless nights, school events, doctor appointments, and countless other challenges, all while shielding them from the bitterness of abandonment. When Richard offered financial support, she initially resisted, insisting she didn't need charity. But eventually, she accepted, not for herself, but for the opportunities it could give her children. For the Quadruplets, forgiveness came gradually. They began to see Richard not just as the man who had walked away, but as someone trying to rebuild bridges burned long ago. They tested him, questioned him, and sometimes pushed him away. But they also gave him chances to prove himself. Slowly, trust began to take root, fragile yet growing stronger with each passing day. Through it all, Richard faced the painful truth. He couldn't rewrite history, but he could shape the future if they allowed him to. And for the first time in years, he felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. Months turned into years, and Richard's presence in the Quadruplets' lives became less of an anomaly and more of a steady constant. It wasn't always smooth sailing. There were still moments of tension, misunderstandings, and lingering doubts, but Richard remained patient, determined to earn their trust one step at a time. He attended school plays, cheered from the sidelines at soccer games, and helped Benjamin code his first app prototype. With Charlotte, he explored museums and debated scientific theories. With Amelia, he discussed college applications and future career paths. And Daniel? Well, Daniel dragged him to amusement parks, go-kart races, and even karaoke nights, teaching Richard the art of letting loose. Slowly but surely, the walls that had once stood between them began to crumble. The Quadruplets started opening up, sharing stories about their childhood, the struggles of being raised by a single mother, the sacrifices Eleanor made, and the quiet strength she instilled in them. They laughed together over inside jokes they created along the way, forging memories that felt both new and long overdue. For Richard, these moments filled a void he hadn't realized existed, a sense of belonging he'd chased unsuccessfully through wealth and success. Eleanor, too, softened toward him. While she never fully forgave him for leaving, she acknowledged the effort he was putting into repairing what he had broken. Their relationship evolved into something resembling friendship, built on mutual respect and a shared love for the children. She allowed Richard to contribute financially, not as repayment for past wrongs, but as a means to give the Quadruplets opportunities they deserved. Together, they navigated co-parenting dynamics, finding a rhythm that worked for everyone involved. The turning point came during Daniel's high school graduation ceremony. As Richard sat proudly in the audience, watching his youngest child walk across the stage to receive his diploma, tears welled up in his eyes. This moment, a milestone he almost missed, was a testament to how far they'd come. Later that evening, during a small family celebration, Daniel pulled Richard aside. "You know," he said with a grin, "you're not half bad for a dad who showed up late." Richard chuckled, pulling Daniel into a hug. "Thanks, kiddo. That means a lot." Amelia approached next, holding out a framed photo of the five of them, taken weeks earlier. "We thought you should have this," she said softly. "It's kind of symbolic." The picture captured a rare moment of genuine happiness. Richard surrounded by the Quadruplets, their smiles bright and unguarded. For the first time, Richard truly felt like part of the family. Benjamin and Charlotte joined them shortly after, teasing Richard about his lack of tech skills, while simultaneously congratulating him on helping fund Benjamin's startup idea. Even Eleanor lingered nearby, her warm smile signaling approval. In that moment, Richard realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better future together. Looking back, Richard couldn't undo the years he'd lost or the pain he caused. But he had learned something invaluable. Family wasn't defined by blood alone. It was shaped by love, effort, and the willingness to grow. The Langley household was no longer fractured. It was whole, united by four remarkable children who carried pieces of both parents within them. As the sun set on another chapter of their lives, Richard stood alongside Eleanor and the Quadruplets, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Redemption hadn't been easy, but it had been worth every step. And though the scars of the past would always remain, they now served as reminders of how far they'd come together.